Prophecy. The last 17 books of the Old Testament are books of prophecy, except for Lamentations. Each book is named for its author. God sent these prophets at different times in Israel's and Judah's history. They called the people back to God and warned them that God would punish their disobedience. Isaiah prophesied in Judah during the reigns of kings Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. He repeatedly warned the people that Jerusalem and Judah would be judged because of their wickedness. In chapter 39, he predicted the Babylonian exile, but he also held out hope that the kingdom would be restored. Beginning in chapter 40, Isaiah offered comfort with these promises from God. The Babylonian exiles would be allowed to return to Jerusalem. A righteous suffering servant would bring salvation, and God would set up a new righteous kingdom. Jeremiah, like Isaiah, was a young man called by God to warn Judah about its wickedness. Excuse me. Jeremiah spent the first 20 years of his ministry under Josiah, a good king who tried to bring the people of Judah back to God. But after this, Jeremiah was often in danger from political and religious leaders who were angry about his messages. God protected Jeremiah so he could continue to warn the wicked and to comfort those who trusted in God. After Jerusalem was destroyed, Jeremiah chose to remain with the people, and he went with them to Egypt. Lamentations, the title of this book, means funeral songs. The author was probably Jeremiah, and he was grieving about the destruction of Jerusalem. He confessed the people's sin and prayed to God for mercy. Ezekiel is named after the prophet Ezekiel, who was present in Jerusalem. He was taken to Babylon with other Jewish exiles in 598 BC. Chapters 1 through 24 are prophecies about Jerusalem's destruction. Then after Jerusalem was destroyed, Ezekiel preached a new message of hope that the people of Israel would return to Palestine. Daniel tells the well-known story of Daniel and his 3 friends who were taken to captivity. These 4 men continued to obey and worship God, even though it sometimes put their lives in danger. In the last 6 chapters of this book, Daniel described his visions of the rise and fall of earthly kingdoms, and finally the rise of an everlasting kingdom. Hosea was a prophet in the northern kingdom of Israel during the reign of King Jeroboam II, if I said that correctly. Chapters 1 through 3 tell about Hosea's love for his unfaithful wife. In the rest of the book, Hosea uses marriage as a picture of God's love for unfaithful Israel. Joel prophesied at the time of King Joash. He described the terrible plague of locusts that invaded Palestine. Then Joel warned the people to turn to God in repentance, and he announced that the day of the Lord would come and bring even greater judgment. Amos was a shepherd called by God to be a prophet in the northern cities of Israel. He announced God's judgment on the people for turning away from God, for being cruel to the poor, and for living selfishly. Obadiah, the shortest book in the Bible, is a book of prophecy against the nation of Edom. Obadiah announced God's judgment against them and prophesied that their kingdom would be destroyed. Jonah was a prophet from God called to preach in the foreign city of Nineveh. Jonah tried to run away from God and was swallowed by a great fish. When the fish returned him to the land, Jonah went to Nineveh and warned the people about God's judgment. Jonah learned that God would forgive even a heathen city if the people were sorry for their sins. Micah contains the writings of a prophet who lived in the countryside of Judah during the reigns of Ahaz and Hezekiah. Micah warned about God's judgment against Jerusalem and Samaria because of the sinfulness of their leaders. But he promised the restoration of Zion and a kingdom of peace for those who trust in God. He prophesied that a ruler born in Bethlehem would set up a kingdom that will last forever. Nahum is a book of prophecy against Nineveh, the capital of Assyria. The prophet describes the cruelty of the Assyrians as they conquered nation after nation. He predicted the destruction of Nineveh and the end of the kingdom of Assyria. Habakkuk was written as a dialogue or conversation between God and the prophet Habakkuk. First asked why God let wickedness and violence continue. Excuse me, I apologize. When God told him he would send the Babylonians to punish Judah, Habakkuk became more concerned. He didn't understand how God could use the Babylonians, who were even more wicked than the Jews. God answered, the righteous will live by his faith, and the Babylonians would also be judged. Habakkuk ended his book with a psalm of praise. Zephaniah prophesied during the reign of King Josiah. He warned that the day of the Lord would bring judgment on Judah and Jerusalem, and he called the Jews to turn back to God. Zephaniah then predicted that Judah's neighboring nations would be destroyed, and he promised that God would bring his people home. Haggai, 18 years and had passed since Cyrus's decree had allowed the Jews to return from exile, but they still had not finished building God's temple. Haggai's message was that the time had come to build the house of the Lord. He promised that God would fill his house, this house, with his glory. Excuse me. Zechariah's prophecies began 2 months after Haggai's first message. God sent Zechariah 8 visions to encourage the builders of the temple. In chapters 7 and 8, Zechariah called the people to obey God by acting fairly and mercifully to one another. Chapters 9 through 14 predict the coming of Zion's king, the Lord Almighty.